June 24th, 1948, Tempelhof Airfield, American Sector, West Berlin. Colonel William H. Tunner studied the fog rolling across the runway, the grey air thick with the smell of wet coal dust and oil. The first aircraft of the morning convoy, a C-54 Skymaster loaded with flour, climbed through the murk toward the western horizon, disappearing into low cloud before reaching 200 feet. Beneath its vanishing form, the city it served was dying slowly from hunger, cold, and exhaustion. 2 million Berliners surrounded by Soviet forces, cut off from rail, road, and canal, an island of freedom inside a tightening fist. The Berlin blockade had begun. From the tower window, Tunner watched mechanics scraping ice from the wings of the next transport in line. He had studied the mathematics for days: fuel, tonnage, distance, weather probability, maintenance cycles. The arithmetic was impossible. To sustain Berlin, 4,500 tons of supplies per day were required: food, coal, medicine, fuel. A C-54 could carry 10 tons per flight, consuming almost as much fuel in the process as it delivered. To feed the city, more than 1,000 flights would be needed daily. There were barely 120 aircraft available. Airfields on the German side were primitive, the approaches treacherous, the weather unreliable. It couldn't be done. But Tunner knew they would do it anyway. General Lucius D. Clay, commander of US forces in Europe, had already made the decision. There would be no withdrawal from Berlin, no surrender to Soviet pressure, no abandonment of the city that symbolised the Western presence in post-war Germany. The Western Allies would stay, and they would supply Berlin by air alone. The operation was given a deceptively simple code name: Victuals. The British would call their contribution plain fare, but to the men who flew and the Berliners who waited, it became something else entirely: a lifeline made of wings. At Soviet headquarters in Karlshorst, Marshal Vasily Sokolovsky considered the American response with amusement. The western sectors of Berlin had been isolated deliberately, a calculated move to force their evacuation without open warfare. The Soviets controlled every road and railway into the city. Without access to supplies from the west, Berlin would starve in weeks. The air corridors, narrow routes established by four-power agreements, had never been intended for mass transport. No one in military history had ever fed a city of 2 million by air. The Soviet staff regarded the American plan as propaganda, an effort to save face before inevitable retreat. But at Rhine-Main Air Base near Frankfurt, American ground crews were already loading C-47s, the same aircraft that had dropped paratroopers on D-Day, now packed with flour, milk powder and medicine. The first flights began within days. They landed at Tempelhof and Gatow every few minutes, unloading by hand, the cargo carried across the tarmac by human chains of German volunteers. Each plane brought enough food for 1,000 people for a day. Each departure carried hope. Within the first week, the arithmetic of desperation became the arithmetic of resolve. 80 flights a day became 300. The British joined from their bases in Celle and Fassberg, flying Dakotas and York transports into the narrow air lanes that threaded Soviet-occupied territory. The Soviets watched, irritated but cautious. Direct interference would mean open war, something Stalin did not want. So they used other weapons: propaganda, harassment, intimidation. Soviet fighters shadowed the transports at close range. Anti-aircraft batteries tracked them with searchlights. Berliners were told by communist radio that the Americans would abandon them by winter, that the airlift was a trick. But the planes kept coming. By late July, the city's survival was balanced on tonnage and timing. Coal was the greatest problem. Each Berliner needed 4 pounds a day for heat and power. A C-47 could carry only 3 tons. Tunner needed larger aircraft. He ordered the 4-engine C-54 Skymasters from bases in the United States and North Africa, their massive fuselages capable of carrying 10 tons each. They arrived in convoys of gleaming aluminum, lined up on muddy German fields that had never handled such weight before. Runways cracked, tyres shredded. Mechanics worked around the clock, patching, welding, reinforcing. At Tempelhof, engineers carved an entire new runway out of the rubble of bombed apartment blocks. Civilians worked with shovels and picks beside American soldiers. Women carried rocks in buckets. The sound of hammering echoed through the ruins as the airfield expanded into the city itself. When the first C-54 landed on the new strip, Berliners cheered. Every figure on Tunner's charts represented life or death. 1,440 tons of food per day, 3,475 tons of coal, 400 tons of fuel, The target was 4,500. In August, they reached 1,500. In September, 2,000. Every increase meant another neighbourhood heated, another bakery reopened, another hospital lit. The Soviets watched the statistics with growing unease. Their blockade was supposed to bring submission, not defiance. The logistics were relentless. Each aircraft made 3 to 4 flights daily. Pilots flew through fog, storms, and fatigue. Landing intervals were reduced to 3 minutes. No circling, no second chances. If a pilot missed his approach, he returned to base. Tunner's rule was absolute efficiency. Every delay meant hunger. Every crash meant headlines. Berliners adapted. Children ran to the airfields to watch the silver aircraft descend, their bellies rumbling but their spirits lifting with every roar of engines. The city began to live by the rhythm of arrivals and departures. Mothers marked time by aircraft, not clocks. The planes became more than supply. They were proof that the world had not abandoned them. By autumn, the airlift had become the most complex logistics operation in history. The Soviets intensified their efforts to undermine it. Radio jamming, false weather reports, diplomatic pressure, all failed. The skies over Berlin belonged to the transports now. In October, the first snow fell. Coal dust blackened the drifts around Tempelhof. Tunner's charts glowed under lamplight. The numbers had changed again, 4,000 tonnes daily. The impossible had become routine. The city that was supposed to starve now ate bread baked with flour delivered by air. Its lights burned with coal flown over the blockade. At Soviet headquarters, Sokolovsky ordered new intelligence reports. His staff compiled figures from reconnaissance and spies. They calculated total flight hours, tonnage delivered, mechanical losses, accident rates. The numbers were undeniable. The Americans had done what German and Soviet military science both declared impossible. They had fed a metropolis by air. By Christmas 1948, the airlift had delivered over 200,000 tonnes of supplies. Berlin's streets glowed with electric light for the first time in months. The Soviets increased propaganda broadcasts, claiming Western food was poisoned, that Berliners would die of disease. Few believed it now. They could hear the truth overhead. Tunner looked at his charts again, at the impossible figures turned into columns of achievement. The weather outside the operations tent was freezing. Aircraft waited in rows, their wings white with frost, engines idling against the cold. Mechanics moved like shadows beneath their bellies, checking, tightening, refuelling. The first plane of the new day lifted into the grey dawn, rising toward the city that refused to die. The airlift had become not just a supply mission, but a declaration. The West would hold Berlin, whatever the cost. What began as a desperate experiment was turning into the most audacious logistical operation of the post-war world. The Soviets had calculated hunger and despair. The Americans had answered with engines. The siege of Berlin was supposed to prove the limits of freedom. Instead, it proved the limits of coercion. The city survived because mathematics and machinery had found a new purpose. And above the cold ruins, a steady stream of silver wings drew a line in the sky that no blockade could erase. August 12th, 1948, Wiesbaden Air Command, US Zone, Germany. The operations map covered the entire wall, pins and string tracing the thin air corridors from West Germany into the heart of Soviet-occupied territory. Red markers indicated the landing fields at Tempelhof, Gatow, and the newly carved Tegel, where French engineers and Berlin civilians worked night and day to lay pierced steel planking over rubble. Colonel Tunner stood before the map, his staff crowded behind him, fatigue etched into their faces. The Berlin airlift had moved beyond improvisation. It was now an industry, measured in flight hours and tons per man-hour. Tunner called it the conveyor belt in the sky. The corridors were the lifelines, 3 narrow ribbons of controlled airspace, each 20 miles wide, stretching 170 miles from Allied zones in the west to the blockaded city. They passed over Soviet-held land the entire way. 1 corridor inbound, 1 outbound, 1 reserved for emergencies. Within these slender routes, thousands of flights operated daily, stacked vertically in 1,000-foot intervals, separated by only minutes. Any deviation, any delay, could cause catastrophe. Tunner's engineers created a system of absolute precision. Every aircraft had a scheduled takeoff time, altitude, and arrival minute. Pilots called it flying the slot. If you missed your slot, you went home. By mid-August, the C-47 Dakotas were being phased out. They had served bravely but were too small, too slow, too vulnerable to weather. In their place came the C-54 Skymaster, a steel giant with a 110-foot wingspan, 4 Pratt & Whitney engines, and a cargo capacity of 10 tons. The Skymasters could carry enough flour to feed 60,000 Berliners for a day, or enough coal to power a hospital for a week. Each carried fuel sufficient for 2 round trips. Its maintenance demands were brutal, 50 man-hours for every 10 flown. But Tunner didn't care about where. The airlift had become a test not just of logistics, but of will. The British, operating from Celle, Fussberg and Wunstorf, maintained their own convoys, flying Avro Yorks and Handley Page Hastings transports. The Royal Air Force called their operation plain fare, but on the ground and in the air it was one single effort, one continuous rhythm of wings and engines, a heartbeat of defiance. American, British and later French aircraft crossed paths in the grey skies, their vapour trails forming white scars above the Soviet zone. To the citizens of Berlin, that web of contrails was a sign of hope. To Soviet air defence commanders, it was an insult. Inside the city, the results were visible. By late summer, the power stations on the Spree were operating again, fed by coal flown in on American transports. Streetcars ran intermittently. Bakeries reopened, their ovens burning fuel that had come by air. Children no longer fainted in the bread lines. For the first time since June, Berliners could imagine survival. The Soviets escalated their harassment. Fighters from Soviet bases at Stendal and Wittenberg buzzed the corridors, passing within yards of the transports. Weather balloons were launched directly into the flight paths. Anti-aircraft batteries tracked the planes with searchlights. Radio operators transmitted false weather reports, mimicking Allied frequencies. The intent was intimidation, not war, but each manoeuvre risked collision, each false signal risked disaster. Tunner forbade retaliation. "Our weapon is tonnage," he told his crews. "Every flight that lands is victory." Logistics officers in Wiesbaden tracked everything: fuel consumption, load factors, mechanical failures. The data filled notebooks, each line of numbers representing lives sustained. Each C-54 burned 200 gallons of fuel per hour. Each gallon delivered to Berlin cost another half gallon in transport. Tunner's staff calculated the impossible and did it anyway. The greatest obstacle was weather. Central European storms rolled across the corridors with sudden ferocity. On fog days, pilots flew instruments only from takeoff to touchdown, often without seeing the ground until seconds before landing. Tempelhof's approach path threaded between bomb-damaged buildings. Pilots could look down into third-story windows as they descended. One miscalculation meant destruction, not just of the plane, but of faith in the operation. On August 13th, a Skymaster misjudged the approach and clipped a roof near Tempelhof, bursting into flames. The crew perished instantly. The Soviets broadcast the event across Europe, declaring the airlift unsafe, doomed to fail. Tunner ordered operations to continue without pause. The next aircraft landed 9 minutes later, its engines scattering the smoke across the field. There would be no pause for mourning. To maintain the relentless pace, Tunner introduced a new doctrine: round-the-clock flow. Aircraft would operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Crews would be rotated, not machines. Mechanics worked shifts under floodlights, changing engines in freezing rain, replacing entire wings in 12 hours. At Rhine-Main, spare parts were stacked in pyramids. Crews slept under wings between flights. In Berlin, unloading teams, many of them German women, worked in shifts that never stopped. Efficiency was absolute. A C-54 had exactly 30 minutes from touchdown to takeoff. Trucks backed directly to the cargo doors. Coal was shoveled out by hand in black clouds of dust. Engines remained running. If a truck wasn't ready, another replaced it instantly. Every second lost was a meal lost, a house unheated. The airlift had become an organism, its blood the flow of supplies, its pulse the roar of engines. Tunner's staff developed innovations hourly. They installed conveyor belts in aircraft, built temporary hangars from prefabricated kits, and created radio beacons that guided flights through storm and fog. The control tower at Tempelhof became a nerve centre, its operators speaking to aircraft every 30 seconds, sequencing hundreds of landings with machine-like precision. The men who flew the missions were exhausted beyond comprehension. Pilots logged over 100 hours a month, living on coffee, nicotine and benzodrine. They flew through turbulence that threw the massive transports like toys, landing on runways slick with rain and coal dust. Some suffered hallucinations from fatigue, others collapsed at the controls. Yet the flights continued. No one wanted to be the crew that failed Berlin. In September, the figures told the truth. 3,500 tons daily, close to the survival threshold. The impossible was approaching the inevitable. Soviet intelligence officers studying captured data began to realize the meaning. The Americans were not improvising, they were systematizing. The airlift was no longer a gesture, it was becoming permanent. From Moscow came new orders: increase propaganda, tighten pressure, prepare for negotiation. But the blockade, meant to demonstrate Soviet power, had become a demonstration of Western endurance. The more the Soviets restricted, the more the aircraft flew. Each ton of coal, each bag of flour, each canister of milk that descended from the grey sky was an act of resistance visible to the entire world. The night of September 1st, Tunner stood beside the runway at Rhine-Main and watched a convoy of C-54s taxi out, their wingtips glowing in the darkness. The roar of engines filled the air, merging into a single endless note. Each aircraft carried 10 tons of supplies and the proof of what he had known since June, that the physics of flight were no match for the mathematics of determination. The first aircraft lifted into the night, then another and another, until the sky was full of light. In Berlin, miles away, the citizens would soon hear the sound and look up, counting salvation by the minute. The blockade had begun as a political weapon. It was ending as a logistical miracle. The air over Germany, once filled with bombers and death, now carried food, coal, and life. The machinery of destruction had become the machinery of endurance. And as the Soviet blockade entered its third month, the question was no longer whether Berlin could survive by air. It was whether the Soviet Union could endure the humiliation of watching it do so. September 18th, 1948, Tempelhof Airfield, American Sector, Berlin. The morning began with freezing rain and the smell of wet coal. Tempelhof's runways, still slick from night operations, shimmered under weak light as the first aircraft of the day touched down. A C-54 from Rhine-Main, callsign Cowboy 42, landed heavy and late, its tyres throwing spray into the faces of the German ground crew waiting to unload. The cargo was coal, 10 tons, packed in canvas sacks blackened by dust that stained everything it touched. Within minutes, the crew had shut down 2 engines, leaving the other 2 idling to keep the hydraulics pressurised. German labourers, women mostly, their hands wrapped in rags, hauled the sacks out by hand, forming a human chain from cargo bay to truck bed. 30 minutes later, the aircraft was airborne again, its exhaust trails lost in the grey sky. Every 30 seconds, another Skymaster landed. They came from Celle, Fassberg, Wiesbaden, Rhine-Main, each carrying a fragment of Berlin's survival. The unloading teams barely had time to wipe their faces. The roar of one plane merged with the approach of the next, an unending rhythm of metal and thunder. To stand on the tarmac was to feel the city's heartbeat. In the control tower, American and British controllers tracked the procession with pencils and clocks. On their wall map, aircraft moved as coloured pins along the corridors, each separated by exactly 3 minutes. There were no delays, no second chances. The airlift now functioned with the precision of an assembly line. It was not war, it was manufacturing in the sky. General Lucius D. Clay visited Berlin that week, standing with Tunner and his staff at the edge of the runway. They watched as one of the new maintenance convoys passed, a line of fuel trucks, tyre carriers, mobile cranes, and food wagons. Clay said nothing for a long time. Finally, he turned to Tunner. "You've done it," he said. "You've built a factory that runs on hope." Tunner didn't answer. He was watching the next approach, visibility dropping, the wind veering, the pilot fighting cross currents. The Skymaster straightened at the last second, wheels kissing the runway so lightly that the crowd barely heard it touch. Berlin's population had adapted to the rhythm. The newspapers published the daily tonnage on the front page like battle reports. Children timed their mornings by the sound of engines. 6:30, they'd say. The milk planes. The airlift had become life itself. Inside the city, food distribution had stabilised at minimal rations, about 1,700 calories per person per day. The bread came from flour flown in from France, the butter from Denmark, the meat from American stockpiles. Coal fired the generators that powered hospitals and trams. Water treatment plants resumed partial operation. Every necessity had its price in fuel, flight hours, and risk. A single fog day could undo a week of effort. The Soviets, frustrated, intensified their psychological warfare. Communist pamphlets appeared across the city, warning that Western food was contaminated, that children would fall sick from American milk. Few believed it now. Berliners had seen too much. The grey aircraft that droned above the clouds had become symbols of endurance. At Karlshorst, Marshal Sokolovsky convened his senior staff. The reports before him were bleak. The airlift's tonnage exceeded 4,000 per day, close to the threshold for indefinite survival. Soviet attempts at disruption had failed. Intercepted American communications indicated new aircraft arriving monthly. The British had begun using 4-engine Avro Yorks capable of carrying even heavier loads. The blockade's purpose, to force political surrender, was slipping away. Sokolovsky ordered a study of Allied flight patterns. His staff compiled charts showing departure times, intervals, average loads, accident rates. The data revealed an astonishing pattern. The Allies had converted chaos into system. Within 12 weeks, they had established a continuous logistics chain through the sky. Soviet analysts struggled to understand the American method. They called it logistical improvisation, yet it functioned with mechanical precision. The Americans, it seemed, didn't rely on doctrine, they simply made the impossible work. Back in the air, the pilots bore the weight of the operation. They flew in weather that grounded commercial traffic across Europe. Many had survived wartime bombing campaigns and considered the airlift more dangerous. The corridors were narrow, visibility often less than 50 yards, and radio chatter constant. Any mistake could mean collision. They joked grimly that they were flying coal cans into a coffin. Yet the fatalism was mixed with pride. They were not fighting an enemy, they were feeding a city. On September 20th, a cold front from the Baltic rolled over northern Germany. Icing formed at 4,000 feet, turbulence at 5,000. Aircraft wobbled through invisible currents, wings rimmed with ice. At Tempelhof, visibility dropped to 200 yards. Tunner's operations staff advised suspension. Tunner refused. The airlift would not stop for weather, not for anything short of catastrophe. Crews switched to instrument-only landings, guided by radio beacons installed along the approach path. The first hour saw delays, the second saw rhythm restored. The Berliners below heard the engines through the fog and cheered. By October, the figures had become their own weapon. The Allies had delivered over 300,000 tons of supplies in 3 months. Each ton was proof of Western endurance, a statement written in aluminum and aviation fuel. Soviet propagandists stopped quoting tonnage altogether. The numbers undermined their narrative. Instead, they claimed Berlin's survival was a temporary illusion. But Tunner's own calculations told another story. He plotted projections into winter. If flights continued at the current rate and maintenance efficiency held above 80%, Berlin could sustain itself indefinitely. The blockade, once seen as a death sentence, was now a logistical contest, and the Soviets were losing. In late October, British engineers at Fassberg introduced a radical improvement. Instead of hand-loading coal sacks, they used mechanical hoppers to pour coal directly into aircraft holds through chutes. The turnaround time dropped by half. The Americans copied the method immediately. Within a week, coal throughput increased by 500 tonnes per day. Berliners noticed the difference when the streetcars began running again, clattering through the grey streets past Soviet checkpoints. The operation's transformation from emergency to machine astonished outside observers. Journalists arriving from New York and London expected scenes of despair. Instead, they found discipline, efficiency, and an almost religious faith in the machinery. The pilots called themselves the Line. Mechanics spoke of engines as if they were comrades. Berliners waved flags with aircraft silhouettes painted on them. The sky had become a highway of hope. Winter approached, fog thickened, ice returned, and fuel froze in barrels. But the airlift no longer depended on luck. Tunner's systems were self-sustaining. Spare aircraft were pre-positioned at every base. Maintenance parts were standardised. Crews rotated through rest cycles calculated to the hour. Every failure had a procedure. At the Soviet embassy in East Berlin, officials monitored the Western radio frequencies that broadcast tonnage updates. Each report was another humiliation. Stalin had expected Berlin to capitulate in weeks. Instead, it was the blockade that began to show cracks. Soviet propaganda failed. The population of East Berlin grew restless, and Western resolve hardened. The sky over Germany had become a symbol of defiance the entire world could see. By December, Tunner's chart showed 4,700 tonnes daily, beyond survival into surplus. The warehouses in Berlin filled faster than they emptied. Clay sent a message to Washington: "The blockade is broken in all but name." The victory had not been declared, but it was already visible from every rooftop in Berlin. The sound of engines had become the city's anthem. The Soviets faced an unspoken truth. Their weapon had failed. The blockade, meant to starve the West, had instead fed unity. The airlift had turned isolation into connection, weakness into strength. Stalin could close the roads, but he could not close the sky. As snow fell on Tempelhof at the end of 1948, the night convoys continued, their running lights glinting through the storm. Berliners stood in the streets, watching the faint glows cross the clouds. They knew that above the darkness, thousands of men were risking their lives to keep them alive. The miracle had become routine, and the impossible had become history. For the first time since the war, Berlin was free. Not politically, not yet, but spiritually. Its heartbeat was no longer measured in bombs, but in engines. The city's life came from the sky. December 29th, 1948. Wiesbaden Air Traffic Control Headquarters, Western Germany. The year was ending, but the airlift showed no signs of slowing. Outside, snow buried the taxiways in white silence, but inside the operations building, the noise was relentless. Typewriters clattering, radios hissing, telephones ringing. The great machine Tunner had built now extended from London to Berlin, every hour calculated, every flight logged. A blackboard on the far wall listed the day's tonnage goal in chalk: 5,000 tonnes. Beneath it, the schedule read like a heartbeat: departures from Celle, Fassberg, Rhein-Main, and Wiesbaden marked in 5-minute intervals. Colonel Tunner stood before the board, hands behind his back, scanning the figures. He wore his fatigue uniform unbuttoned at the collar, eyes bloodshot from a night of briefings. The staff called him Willie the Whip behind his back for his relentless insistence on efficiency. To Tunner, the airlift wasn't heroism, it was mathematics. Every delay had a cost measurable in hunger. Every cancelled flight meant an unheated hospital, a darkened school, a family huddled around a dead stove in Berlin. The Soviet blockade had entered its 7th month. The roads and rails remained closed. Barges lay frozen in canals. Yet Berlin lived. It didn't thrive, but it endured. And that endurance was victory. On the operations table, stacks of weather reports showed the challenge ahead. A freezing fog hung over the entire corridor. Ice thickness on aircraft wings exceeded half an inch within 15 minutes of exposure. The British meteorological officers from Celle called it black ice weather. Invisible, deadly, impossible to forecast. Tunner's engineers had developed new procedures. Glycol spray trucks lined up at each field, de-icing aircraft wings before departure, while mechanics installed heated pitot tubes and oil warmers improvised from electrical coils. Every solution created another problem. The fuel required to keep engines idling during loading was enough to power entire Berlin blocks. The anti-icing fluids froze in barrels. Tyres shattered on frozen taxiways. Ground crews worked through the night with blowtorches and salt. Yet every morning, the Skymasters lifted from the snow-covered runways, engines clawing through cloud and frost. At Tempelhof, conditions were worse. The approach path was short and surrounded by ruins. Pilots called it threading the keyhole. The slightest crosswind sent aircraft skidding sideways. The British airfield at Gatow was little better, a strip of frozen mud and pierced steel planking that buckled under heavy loads. Yet the landings continued, minute after minute, day after day. The Germans watched from rooftops, their breath steaming in the cold, counting the aircraft as they appeared from the fog. Inside the city, the ration cards told the story of endurance. Each Berliner received per week 500 grams of bread, 250 of meat, 125 of fat, 100 of sugar. Coal ration, 2.5 pounds daily. Yet morale, improbably, remained high. The newspapers published the tonnage daily: 4,734 yesterday, 4,988 today, 5,027 tomorrow. Numbers had become nourishment. Marshal Sokolovsky, infuriated, convened a midnight conference at Karlshorst. Reports from Soviet intelligence left little room for optimism. Allied airfields had expanded capacity by 30%. New navigation aids reduced accidents to negligible levels. The British were building additional runways at Celle and Fassberg. The Americans were training replacement pilots at unprecedented rates. The blockade, conceived as a demonstration of Soviet strength, had turned into a monument to Western persistence. Sokolovsky demanded results. Soviet pilots increased their harassment flights. They flew close enough for American crews to see their faces, their gloved hands resting casually on throttles. One Skymaster captain reported a Soviet Yak-9 flying alongside for 20 miles, wagging its wings mockingly before peeling away. Another incident saw a Soviet fighter release a burst of tracer fire 1,000 feet ahead of a transport, a warning shot that went unacknowledged. The Americans ignored every provocation. They didn't come to fight, they came to deliver. In early January, Tunner implemented the next phase, Operation Knickerbocker, the winter schedule. He reduced flight intervals to 2.5 minutes, increased flight altitudes to avoid Soviet interference, and created a new maintenance rotation to keep aircraft in service despite brutal conditions. Crews worked 12-hour shifts, slept 6, and returned to the cockpit. Air crews joked that they lived in 3 states of existence: flying, freezing, or fixing. The tempo was merciless. Each C-54 flew an average of 3 round trips daily, covering 1,000 miles through storms and ice. Pilots used landmarks only when the fog cleared, the Elbe River glinting faintly below, the dark spire of Magdeburg Cathedral, the grey line of the Spree curling through Berlin. In cloud, they relied on instruments alone. The discipline was absolute. A missed slot meant returning home. There were no second attempts. The air corridors were packed so tightly that any deviation risked mid-air collision. Tunner's system, harsh but effective, turned men into extensions of machinery. To outside observers, the airlift appeared miraculous. To those inside it, it was war by another name. War against physics, against fatigue, against the limits of endurance. In a single day, more fuel was burned delivering coal than the entire Berlin electrical grid consumed. Crews slept in cockpits between flights, the heat from the engines seeping through the fuselage. Mechanics lost fingers to frostbite. Nurses at Tempelhof's aid station treated burns from de-icing fluid and exhaustion-induced collapses. Yet the operation grew stronger. By February 1949, 6,000 flights per week moved through the corridors. The average tonnage exceeded 6,000 daily. Berliners began rebuilding life around the certainty of flight. Children drew airplanes in chalk on walls. Shopkeepers timed deliveries to coincide with aircraft arrivals. The airlift had become not just a supply system, but the city's calendar. At the White House, President Truman received daily reports from Clay's headquarters. His advisors urged negotiation, a quiet compromise to end the blockade. Truman refused. "We stay in Berlin," he said, period. For him, the airlift was no longer a military problem, it was a statement of civilization itself. In March, Tunner's operations reached a peak efficiency unimaginable at the start. Aircraft turnaround time averaged 26 minutes, maintenance efficiency exceeded 85%. Fuel and food deliveries balanced perfectly with Berlin's consumption. The blockade had become irrelevant. Stalin's attempt to isolate the city had instead unified it under Allied protection. Berliners began calling the American and British airmen Himmelsbrücke, the Bridge of Heaven. The term spread across the newspapers, the radio and the conversations in every cold apartment. For the first time in living memory, Germans referred to foreign soldiers not as conquerors, but as saviours. The Soviet press fell silent. Pravda published no mention of the airlift after March 10th. The statistics were too humiliating. Western aircraft were landing at a rate of 1 every 63 seconds. Soviet rail lines sat empty. By spring, the airlift had become unstoppable. The fog lifted, the sun returned, and the skies cleared. Aircraft moved like clockwork, silver dots tracing lines across the blue. Berliners gathered on rooftops to watch, waving as the planes descended. One boy, standing beside the ruins of his home, held up a cardboard sign scrawled with English words, "Thank you." The operation had transcended logistics. It had become a moral argument conducted by engines. Each flight said what no speech could, that freedom, however fragile, would not be abandoned. On April 16, 1949, Tunner decided to prove it once and for all. He ordered the most ambitious feat of the entire airlift, Operation Easter Parade, a demonstration of total capacity. For 24 hours, every available aircraft, crew and runway would operate without pause. At midnight, the first Skymaster lifted off from Rhine-Main. Another followed every 60 seconds. The flow did not stop for an entire day. By the next midnight, the numbers were staggering. 1,398 flights, 12,940 tonnes of cargo delivered, no accidents. The Soviet blockade was officially broken. In Karlshorst, Sokolovsky received the report in silence. The conclusion was inescapable. The Americans had accomplished the impossible again. This time not by tanks or armies, but by trucks of the sky. The Berlin airlift had begun as desperation. It had become endurance. Now it was triumph. The world had seen an army feed a city from the clouds, and the message could not be recalled. The blockade had failed. The city had lived. And every man who had flown those corridors knew that history would never again measure strength by tanks alone. It would measure it by tonnage, by faith, by the roar of engines lifting through fog toward the waiting city below. April 17th, 1949, Tempelhof Airfield, American Sector, Berlin. The morning after Operation Easter Parade dawned bright and cloudless, the first clear sky in weeks. The air above Berlin shimmered with contrails, long white scars that crisscrossed from horizon to horizon. The city had awakened to the sound of triumph. 12,940 tonnes of supplies delivered in 24 hours without a single crash. The impossible figure spread through Berlin like rumour, then revelation. Newspapers printed it in bold across the front page. Radios repeated it hourly. School children memorised it as though it was scripture. General Lucius D. Clay arrived from Wiesbaden at noon, escorted by Colonel Tunner and British Air Commodore Reginald Waite. They stood together on the apron, the wind whipping their coats, as a line of C-54s taxied past for departure. Their engines thundered so loud that conversation was useless. Clay simply raised his hand to his ear, then to the sky, a gesture that meant everything. They can't stop us anymore. For Berliners, the airlift had become part of their identity. The city's daily life revolved around its rhythm. Shopkeepers set clocks by engine noise. Mothers woke their children with the dawn flights. Newspapers listed airlift schedules beside the weather reports. The people of Berlin lived in partnership with the sky. The Soviets could no longer conceal their failure. Internal reports to Moscow admitted the truth. The Western Allies had achieved a sustained throughput of more than 8,000 tonnes daily, far exceeding the city's minimum survival threshold. The blockade's original intent, to force a Western withdrawal, was now politically impossible. Even Stalin's closest advisers acknowledged it privately. But the Soviet dictator would not yet yield. He ordered the blockade to continue, hoping fatigue or accident might yet reverse the outcome. In the Allied command, Tunner pressed his advantage. "Now we make it routine," he said at staff briefing. "Predictable, boring, unstoppable." The word boring became the highest praise in the airlift's vocabulary. Boring meant no accidents. Boring meant Berlin alive. The logistics had evolved into a perfect machine. A plane took off every minute and a half. Each carried a 10-tonne average load. At its peak, more than 300 aircraft were airborne simultaneously within the narrow corridors over Soviet-occupied territory. The routes were defined with mathematical exactness, altitude bands stacked from 5,000 to 13,000 feet, separated by precise time intervals. The pilots flew by stopwatch, not instinct. The margin of error was 30 seconds. To keep the system running, Tunner demanded discipline that bordered on obsession. Each C-54 arriving at Tempelhof had 30 minutes on the ground. No more, no less. Engines stayed running during unloading. Coal dust choked the air, mixing with snow and exhaust to form a grey paste that coated everything. Berliners volunteering on the unloading lines wore goggles and scarves, their faces blackened but smiling. They called the coal dust black snow. Every week the numbers grew. 5,000 tonnes daily became 6,000, then 7,000. In May, the record of 12,940 tonnes stood unchallenged, a monument to efficiency. The Soviet military, monitoring Allied radio frequencies, began referring to the airlift bitterly as the Iron River. Berlin's spirit changed with the season. The winter of hunger was over. Streetlights glowed at night. Trams ran regularly. Bakeries smelled of warm bread for the first time in months. The city, once half in darkness, now radiated light visible even from the Soviet zone. To the east, communist newspapers warned that American aid enslaves the German worker. But in Berlin, the proof of freedom was in every loaf, every lamp, every child walking to school in the morning light. Marshal Sokolovsky requested permission from Moscow to negotiate. Stalin hesitated, reluctant to admit defeat, but the facts were undeniable. The airlift had become permanent. The blockade? Pointless. Soviet intelligence estimated Allied flight capacity at 9,000 tons daily by midsummer. Even if they shot down aircraft, the propaganda damage would be catastrophic. Stalin chose the only retreat left to him: silence. Meanwhile, the Allies expanded the operations infrastructure. A new airfield at Tegel was completed entirely by hand labour, constructed in less than 3 months from bombed-out rubble. French engineers directed thousands of Berlin civilians, including women and children, who filled craters with stones and laid perforated steel planking under constant Soviet observation. The first aircraft to land at Tegel carried milk powder. The second carried coal. Both were greeted by cheering crowds. The Soviet guards watching from the perimeter fence did not intervene. Their orders were to observe, not provoke. One of them, a young lieutenant, wrote in his diary later, recovered by German authorities. They build airports like ants build hills. They never stop. By May 1949, the airlift's momentum was irreversible. Allied negotiators and Soviet envoys met secretly in New York and Moscow. The Western position was firm: lift the blockade unconditionally or face permanent division of Germany. The Soviets stalled, hoping the Allies would declare victory and stop on their own. But the flights continued, day and night, an unbroken roar of defiance. Inside Berlin, the change was psychological as much as material. The city's inhabitants no longer saw themselves as victims. They had endured siege and survived. The airlift had restored a sense of purpose. They began planting gardens in bomb craters, reopening theatres, rebuilding schools. Children played games mimicking the airlift, holding paper airplanes and shouting, "Ich bin ein Flieger," I'm a flyer. On May 4th, 1949, Soviet radio broadcast an announcement without warning. Beginning May 12th, all roads, railways and canals into Berlin would reopen. There was no ceremony, no acknowledgement of defeat, only the practical admission of failure. The blockade, after 11 months, was over. At Tempelhof, crews received the news in silence, then in cheers. Airmen embraced on the tarmac. Mechanics wiped coal dust from their faces and wept. Berliners gathered outside the airfields, waving flags improvised from bedsheets. Church bells rang for the first time since before the blockade. General Clay's headquarters issued orders to continue flights for 90 more days, stockpiling supplies in case the Soviets closed the borders again. Tunner accepted without question. "We finish what we started," he said. "We don't trust silence." For Berlin, May 12th was Liberation Day. Trains rolled in from the west for the first time in nearly a year. Their whistles mingled with the drone of aircraft still arriving overhead. People lined the streets, waving at the first truck convoys, but their eyes remained fixed on the sky. The airlift had become more than logistics. It was memory, identity, belief. The Soviet gamble had failed utterly. They had tried to starve a city into submission and instead created a symbol of endurance the world could not ignore. The Berlin airlift had not only saved 2 million people, it had defined the first moral battle of the Cold War, and the West had won it without firing a shot. At Wiesbaden, Tunner reviewed the final tallies. From June 1948 to May 1949, Allied aircraft had flown more than 277,000 missions, delivering over 2.3 million tonnes of food, fuel and supplies. 101 lives lost, 25 aircraft destroyed, but the city had survived. The figures were staggering, but for Tunner, the meaning lay elsewhere. He thought of the German women unloading coal in freezing rain, of the pilots flying blind through fog, of the children at Tempelhof waving at planes they called Rosenbomber, raisin bombers. He thought of the first days when every flight felt like a miracle, and the later months when miracles had become routine. He wrote in his final report, "We proved that will can defeat walls, that the sky is a road when courage drives it." In Moscow, Stalin read the final communiqué from Sokolovsky and said nothing. The blockade had failed, the airlift had won, and a new line had been drawn across Europe, not on the ground, but in the air. On September 30th, 1949, the final official airlift flight departed Rhine-Main for Berlin. It carried nothing symbolic, no flag or message, just flour, milk and fuel. The aircraft landed at Tempelhof at dusk, engines idling as the crew stepped down. Berliners gathered to watch. No speeches were made. The sound of engines fading into the night was enough. When the last aircraft lifted off again for the return flight, its running lights dwindled into the sky above a city that had learned to trust the sound of wings. For the first time in modern history, an army had sustained a metropolis without conquest. The weapons were engines, the ammunition was food, and the victory was freedom itself. The blockade had begun with a wall of silence. It ended with a roar that echoed across the world, the sound of 6,000 engines carrying faith, resolve, and survival through hostile skies, proving that in the age of air and industry, the side that controls supply controls destiny. The Berlin airlift was over, the city lived, and the world had learned that logistics, once again, had become strategy. September 30th, 1949, Tempelhof Airfield, Berlin. The last transport touched down at dusk, engines droning low over the rooftops still blackened by war. Its wingtips gleamed in the dying light as it rolled to a stop on the runway that had once been mud, rubble and defiance. The cargo manifest was unremarkable. Flour, powdered milk, a few drums of aviation fuel, but the moment was not. The Berlin airlift, which had fed a city for 15 months, had officially ended. General Lucius D. Clay stood on the tarmac beside a small delegation of officers, watching the aircraft's engines spool down. The air smelled of dust and oil and wet stone. Behind him, hundreds of Berliners pressed against the perimeter fence, silent. For the first time in over a year, there was no roar overhead, no rhythm of landings every few minutes. The silence felt foreign, unreal, almost wrong. Colonel Tunner approached, cap tucked under his arm, his face drawn but composed. "That's it, sir," he said quietly. "Last one in." "We're standing down at midnight." Clay nodded. "I'll believe it when I don't hear them anymore." He turned toward the crowd beyond the fence. "They'll miss the sound." "They already do," Tunner said. The airlift had ended not with ceremony but with precision, just as it had run. Every schedule, every sortie, every ton had been measured to the minute. In 15 months, more than 277,000 flights had carried 2.3 million tons of supplies into Berlin. The total distance flown equalled more than 91 million miles, enough to travel to the moon, and back nearly 200 times. The cost exceeded $224 million, but the value was beyond arithmetic. The city lived, and the West's resolve had been proven before the entire world. For Berliners, the victory was visible in every street. Shop windows glowed with electric light. Coal smoke rose from chimneys again. Streetcars clattered through intersections where Soviet tanks had once rumbled. Children played beside ruins still unrepaired, throwing paper airplanes into the air and shouting, "Rosenenbomber," the name they had given to the Allied transports that once dropped the candy from the sky. The airlift had not been perfect. 101 lives were lost. Pilots, mechanics, ground crew and civilians. Their memorial stood near the entrance to Tempelhof, a simple concrete arch reaching upward in 3 curving prongs, one for each air corridor through which the lifeline had flowed. Berliners called it the Hunger Hark, the Hunger Rake. Visitors placed flowers at its base, their petals blackened by the city's endless coal dust. On the Soviet side, silence had replaced rhetoric. The blockade had been lifted in May, but the humiliation endured. Stalin never admitted defeat publicly. Instead, the Soviet press simply ceased mentioning the matter. Within months, the eastern zone of Germany was sealed, its borders hardening into what would soon be called the Iron Curtain. The division of Europe, born from political conflict, had been forged in the air. For the Western Allies, the airlift became doctrine. The lessons were immediate and profound. Logistics could no longer be considered a supporting arm of strategy. It was strategy. The ability to sustain a population or an army regardless of geography or blockade was now the measure of power. The airlift had made that plain. American officers spoke of tonnage warfare. The weapon was no longer the bomb or the bullet, but the cargo manifest. Tunner, reviewing the final reports at Wiesbaden, saw more than statistics. He saw a new form of conflict, a struggle waged through endurance and precision rather than destruction. The airlift had not killed a single enemy, yet it had defeated a superpower's plan. It had turned aircraft into instruments of persuasion, flight schedules into political statements. Where the Red Ball Express had made speed the weapon of war, the Berlin Airlift had made consistency the weapon of peace. In post-war Germany, the impact extended beyond survival. The airlift rebuilt trust between occupier and occupied. German civilians who had once feared Allied soldiers now shared cigarettes and coffee with them, waved at their planes, and prayed for their safety. The daily partnership between Berliners and airmen became the first bridge of the new Europe. It was not made of stone or steel, but of faith and engines. President Truman, receiving the final dispatch from Clay's headquarters, issued a simple statement. We stayed in Berlin and we kept our word. To the American public, weary from war but wary of Soviet ambition, the airlift was proof that resolve and ingenuity could win battles without armies. To the world, it was a message written in the sky, that the United States would not retreat from its commitments, that freedom could be sustained by persistence as surely as by force. In the British Parliament, Prime Minister Clement Attlee summarised it differently. We have shown, he said, that tyranny cannot starve free men into submission. The aircraft of the airlift have carried more than food. They have carried honour. The operation's influence reached beyond geopolitics. It revolutionised aviation itself. Procedures developed during the airlift, radar-controlled landings, stacked air corridors, maintenance rotation systems, became standard practice for civil aviation worldwide. Airlines studied Tunner's methods. Air traffic control evolved from his scheduling tables. What began as emergency improvisation became the foundation of modern air logistics. In the months following the final flight, Berlin struggled to adjust to normal silence. When the skies cleared and no aircraft appeared, people looked up instinctively, uneasy at the stillness. Children missed the candy drops. Adults missed the reassurance of engines above the clouds. The city had lived to hear that sound. Now it lived with its echo. Tunner left Germany in October 1949. His departure was unannounced. He walked once more through Tempelhof, past the hangars where mechanics had worked in sleet and rain, past the spot where the first Skymaster had landed, past the control tower where the world's most intricate choreography of flight had been directed. The airfield was quiet except for wind moving through the empty dispersal bays. He stopped at the base of the Hungerhack and placed a small piece of coal there, a fragment of the cargo that had saved a city. In his final report, written aboard the transport taking him home, he concluded with words that echoed across decades. The airlift proved that industry can replace conquest, that discipline can replace violence, that the will to supply can overcome the will to destroy. In the future, the power that feeds will always outlast the power that starves. The Berlin airlift had begun as desperation, grown into defiance, and ended as definition. It was the first victory of the Cold War, won not by armies, but by air crews, mechanics, and civilians who refused to yield. Their weapons were aircraft, their ammunition was food, their battlefield was the sky. As the last plane vanished into the evening haze over Tempelhof, Berliners watched in silence. The sound faded slowly, leaving only the rustle of wind against the fences. The city it had saved stood alive and unbroken, proof that in the modern world, logistics was no longer the servant of strategy. It was the strategy. And somewhere far above the darkening city, in the clear air where the contrails dissolved into twilight, history left its final signature. A sky once filled with bombers, now redeemed by the wings that had brought life instead of death. October 1st, 1949, Berlin. The dawn broke pale and silent over a city that had learned to listen for the sky. For the first time in 15 months, the horizon remained clear. No engines, no thunder of propellers, no glow of navigation lights threading through fog. Berlin woke to absence, the missing rhythm that had once measured every hour of its survival. The airlift was over. In the streets, life resumed its ordinary pace. Streetcars clanged through intersections, their tracks gleaming with rain. Shopkeepers lifted shutters, displaying goods that had been scarce for years. Housewives queued for bread without ration cards, their baskets filled with food not flown from the west, but delivered by rail once more. Yet each face that passed carried the same unconscious habit. Eyes raised upward, searching the empty sky, waiting for the sound that no longer came. At Tempelhof, the hangars stood half empty. Mechanics walked among the parked aircraft, hands in pockets, uncertain what to do. The field that had once been the busiest airport on Earth now echoed with wind and memory. A few planes remained on standby, their aluminum skins dull from coal dust and frost. Their engines were silent but ready, as though unwilling to believe their duty was finished. Colonel William Tunner visited one last time before departing for the United States. He walked along the perimeter fence where Berliners had once pressed their faces against the wire, cheering the arrivals. The grass beyond was torn and rutted from months of trampling. Children played nearby, tossing paper airplanes made from old ration forms. They laughed as the paper gliders rose briefly, then fell. Tunner smiled faintly, recognising something unspoken in the gesture, a child's instinct to keep what had saved them. In the control tower, an officer handed him the final statistics. He read them aloud, slowly, like a prayer. Total flights, 277,000. Supplies delivered, more than 2,326,000 tonnes. Fuel consumed, 75 million gallons. Distance flown, over 92 million miles. Lives lost, 101. The numbers filled 2 pages, each column a monument to calculation and endurance. Tunner studied them without emotion, the way a craftsman might examine the finished work of his hands. "They'll never understand what those numbers mean," he said quietly. The officer nodded. He didn't need to ask who they were, the world beyond Berlin, the people who would read the figures and see only arithmetic, not what had lived and died within it. The operation's success had redefined the language of power. Where armies once marched, supply lines now flew. Where generals once spoke of battle, they spoke now of tonnage, scheduling and throughput. The lessons of the Red Ball Express in France had found their ultimate expression in the skies over Germany. The Americans had turned logistics into weaponry, relentless, mathematical, unstoppable. Across the city, Berliners marked the end in their own way. In the Charlottenburg district, a bakery baked loaves in the shape of C-54 Skymasters. Children lined the streets, waving at any aircraft that happened to pass overhead, whether civilian or military. Churches held services of thanksgiving, their pews filled with people who had once prayed for bread and now prayed simply for peace. At the Allied Kommandatur on Kaiserdamm, the four-power administration that had once governed Berlin together met for the last time. The Soviet representative, a colonel with heavy eyes, arrived late and left early. His presence was symbolic, his silence louder than any speech. The lines between East and West were now permanent, and both sides knew it. The airlift had drawn them as clearly as any frontier. In Moscow, Stalin received the final reports with cold fury. His attempt to starve Berlin into submission had not only failed, it had united his adversaries. Within months, West Germany would form as a new state under Allied protection. NATO would follow soon after. The blockade that was meant to divide had instead bound the Western powers together. The dictator who had conquered half of Europe had been defeated not by armies, but by the steady rhythm of cargo planes. For the Americans, the airlift became the blueprint of modern strategy. It demonstrated that global reach was not achieved through conquest, but through logistics. In Washington, the newly established Department of Defense studied Tunner's methods. Civilian airlines adopted his scheduling algorithms and maintenance protocols. The phrase air bridge entered the vocabulary of diplomacy, meaning not just flight, but faith. For Berliners, the memory never faded. Decades later, old men and women still paused at the sound of an approaching aircraft, their faces turning upward instinctively. The children who had caught chocolate bars tied to parachutes from Gail Halvorsen, the candy bomber, grew up to tell their own children that salvation had once come from the clouds. When they spoke of freedom, they used the same word they had used for the airlift, Luftbrücke, the air bridge. In time, the airfields built in desperation became monuments. At Tempelhof, the runways remained open long after the last transport departed, their concrete seams marked by the wheels of aircraft that had carried life through blockade. A museum rose beside the Hungerhawk Memorial, filled with photographs, uniforms, and the rusted remains of an old C-54 engine. The guide spoke of numbers, but visitors stood longest before the wall of portraits, the faces of the men who had died delivering coal and bread. On the first anniversary of the blockade's end, the citizens of Berlin gathered at Tempelhof to celebrate. Planes flew overhead once more, not for necessity but remembrance. Among them was Halvorsen himself, dropping candy again for the children. The sweets drifted down on small white parachutes, just as they had before. When the children reached for them, their parents looked upward too, not for sugar, but for the sound that had once meant survival. General Clay returned for the ceremony. Standing before the crowd, he spoke not as a commander but as a witness. "We proved," he said, "that liberty can be fed by wings." The world saw a city refuse to die because free men refused to let it die. His words were met with silence first, then applause that rolled like thunder across the airfield. Tunner, standing at the edge of the crowd, did not speak. He watched the planes circling overhead and thought of those nights when the fog was so thick that even the runway lights were invisible, when men flew blind on instruments and faith alone. He thought of the long convoys in the sky, of engines labouring through snow and storm, of Berliners waving from ruined streets. He thought of the moment he realised that the operation had become something larger than war, a demonstration that industry, precision and moral endurance could defy tyranny. When the ceremony ended, Tunner left the field quietly, walking alone through the crowds. Behind him, the sky filled again with the echo of engines. Not military this time, but memory. The sound of what it meant to believe that the impossible could be done with enough will, enough fuel, enough flight hours. The Berlin airlift was history now, its statistics recorded, its heroes scattered across continents. But the truth remained carved into the conscience of the modern world. That power is not only measured by destruction, but by the ability to build and sustain. That a nation's strength lies not only in its soldiers, but in its mechanics, its pilots, its planners, and the civilians who refuse to surrender. In the age of atomic fear and ideological walls, the airlift stood as the proof of another kind of might. The might to give, to endure, to supply. It taught that a steady stream of engines could defeat an empire's blockade, that a city could live on hope delivered at 3-minute intervals, and that freedom could fly on wings of steel and faith. When the sun set that evening, its light caught the curved arms of the Hunger Hark Memorial, casting 3 long shadows across the tarmac. They stretched eastward over the city that had survived, over the ruins still standing, over the line that now divided Europe. The shadows merged into one before fading into the dusk, like contrails dissolving into memory. Berlin would rise again, rebuilt from rubble, its heartbeat restored. But beneath its streets, beneath its rebuilt walls, lay the invisible foundation poured during those months of siege, the faith that logistics could become salvation, that flight could become freedom. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the echo of thousands of engines still lingered, a reminder to every generation that followed. Walls can isolate, armies can threaten, but the steady will to sustain, to keep flying, to keep feeding, to keep believing, can move mountains of coal and tons of hope through any blockade on Earth. October 5th, 1949, Western Berlin. Rain swept across the city in grey sheets, rattling against the glassless windows of buildings still pockmarked by artillery from a war barely ended. The ruins of the Reichstag stood like the skeleton of a fallen age, and beyond them, under a low sky, Tempelhof Airport glistened dark with rainwater. A few transport planes, leftovers, relics, sat tethered near the hangars, engines sealed, markings fading. They would soon be sent home, or to scrap, or to museums. For now they slept, silent witnesses to a triumph already drifting toward legend. Berlin itself was moving forward, cautious but alive. Reconstruction had begun in earnest, the tempo driven by the same urgency that had once fueled the airlift. Cranes rose above ruins. Trains rattled along newly repaired rails. The smell of fresh mortar replaced the scent of coal smoke. And through it all, the memory of flight lingered, as persistent as the hum of a remembered engine. At a school in the American sector, a teacher asked her pupils to describe the airlift. The children raised their hands eagerly. "The planes brought food," said one. "They brought coal," said another. A small boy stood and said quietly, "They brought us our city back." The class fell silent. Outside, the wind stirred through the bare trees, and for a moment everyone could hear what wasn't there, the sound of wings. In Washington, the last reports of Operation Vittles crossed President Truman's desk. He read the summaries with quiet satisfaction. The figures were clear. The Western powers had not merely survived the blockade, they had rendered it meaningless. The Berlin airlift had become the greatest humanitarian and logistical achievement in modern history. Truman's note to the Joint Chiefs was characteristically short. "Well done. Keep ready." The phrase echoed the new reality. The airlift was no longer an emergency, it was precedent. In staff colleges and war rooms, officers dissected every detail. Fuel ratios, maintenance cycles, flight coordination. The conclusions would guide not just military planners, but civilian engineers for generations. Efficiency, once a matter of economy, had become a principle of survival. Colonel Tunner, now preparing for reassignment to the newly formed Military Air Transport Service, spent his final week in Berlin visiting every airfield that had carried the city's lifeline. He walked the length of Tegel's runway, still lined with the hand-laid steel planking installed by Berlin's women. He shook hands with French engineers, British controllers, German labourers. To each, he said the same thing. You made the impossible look ordinary. At Gatow, he watched as a group of German teenagers painted over old airlift signage on a hangar wall. They stopped when they recognised him. One of them, a boy no older than 16, approached shyly and saluted. His English was halting but clear. "Sir," he said, "we were hungry. You made us fool. My father says we must build as you flew." Tunner smiled. "Then you'll build forever," he replied. That evening, Tunner returned to his quarters overlooking the Spree. On his desk lay a telegram from Air Force Headquarters. New assignment, Pacific Theatre, effective immediately. He folded the message carefully and placed it beside a photograph of Tempelhof taken at the height of the airlift. Runways crowded with aircraft, sky alive with movement. He stared at it for a long time. The image seemed impossible now, a fever dream of light and motion. Yet it had happened. He had watched it happen. In Moscow, the aftermath was darker. The Soviet leadership convened a series of closed meetings to analyse the failure. The transcripts, later declassified, revealed the depth of the shock. One general remarked, "The Americans have made gravity their servant. They can now move mountains through air." Another concluded bitterly, "We built walls, they built roads in the sky." The lesson was not lost. Within a decade, both superpowers would measure strength not just by armies or bombs, but by how much they could move and how fast. Berlin, divided now into East and West, became the physical embodiment of that competition. On one side, Soviet reconstruction projects rose like monuments to discipline and ideology. Mass housing blocks, factories, parades. On the other, American-funded reconstruction brought neon lights, cinemas, and the hum of commerce. Yet across both sides of the city, the people remembered the same thing. When everything else had failed, planes had come. At Tempelhof, the Americans organised one final ceremony before departing. 1,000 Berliners gathered behind the wire fence, waving flags stitched from scraps of fabric. A military band played the Star-Spangled Banner, followed by "God Save the King" and "Deutschland über alles," each anthem blending into the next in the cold wind. Clay and Tunner stood together one last time. "You think they'll forget?" Clay asked quietly. "Not this," Tunner said. "You can forget bombs, you can forget armies, but you don't forget who kept you alive." When the music ended, the crowd began to sing, first softly, then louder, until their voices drowned the engines of a departing aircraft. The melody was the same hymn sung during the blockade, the one Berliners had taken as their own. "Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott, a mighty fortress is our God." It rose into the sky like smoke, carrying with it a city's gratitude. After the ceremony, Tunner boarded the transport that would take him home. As the plane climbed, Berlin unfurled beneath him, a patchwork of ruins, rebuilding, and rebirth. The Spree wound through it like a silver thread. To the east, the Soviet zone stretched in grey silence. To the west, sunlight glimmered on rooftops. The line between them was invisible yet absolute. He thought of how it had all begun, with a blockade meant to starve, a gamble that freedom would yield to hunger. The Soviets had believed that the arithmetic of survival was immutable, but the Americans had rewritten it in fuel and flight plans, in engines and endurance. They had proved that numbers could defy gravity, that the limits of supply were not the limits of will. The aircraft levelled at 10,000 feet. Below, the Hunger Hark Memorial gleamed faintly, its three arms pointing skyward. From that height, it looked almost like a compass. Tunner smiled. "Pointing the way," he murmured. By the time he landed in Frankfurt, the night had deepened. He stepped out onto the tarmac, the air cold and still. The silence pressed against him, the silence of peace earned not through destruction, but through delivery. He realised, as he stood there, that the future of warfare had changed forever. The next battles would be fought not for ground, but for momentum. The nations that could move fastest, sustain longest, and deliver most would shape history. The Berlin airlift had proven that supply could be strategy, that faith could be engineered, that survival could be scheduled. Its legacy would echo in every conflict to come, in Korea, in Vietnam, in humanitarian corridors around the world. Whenever aircraft rose to feed rather than to bomb, the shadow of Berlin would be there, guiding them. And though the planes were gone, though the runways had emptied and the engines fallen silent, the sound remained, in the imagination, in the conscience, in the memory of a world that had watched 2 million people kept alive by air alone. Long after Tunner's departure, Berliners still told the story. Parents told their children of nights when the sky growled like a living thing, when salvation fell from the clouds. The children asked what it was like, and the elders answered with the same words every time. It was the sound of freedom coming from above. The world would change, borders would harden, and wars would follow, but the principle born in those 15 months would never die. That the measure of power is not only how many you can destroy, but how many you can sustain. And on quiet nights, when the wind swept across Tempelhof's empty runways, those who still remembered could swear they heard it again. The distant hum of engines, steady and sure, carrying not bombs, but hope. October 10th, 1949, Berlin. The city had returned to sound, but not the sound it once knew. Hammers now replaced engines. The clatter of rebuilding filled the air where propellers had once ruled. Yet even as scaffolding climbed over the ruins, Berlin could not forget the roar that had saved it. Every street still carried traces of that year, chalk markings on walls showing directions to air raid shelters repurposed as food depots, faded English lettering on old supply crates now used as firewood, children's toys made from the parachutes of the candy bombers. Berliners spoke of the airlift as if it had been a visitation, something beyond ordinary human effort. It was as if the sky had pity on us, said one woman, remembering the winter of coal dust and frostbite. Every morning the planes came, and we knew we had not been abandoned. Her words echoed what many felt but could not fully explain. The airlift had not merely sustained life, it had restored dignity. For months afterward, the people still turned upward at the first sign of a passing aircraft. Housewives paused in doorways, workers stopped mid-sentence, children pointed skyward. The habit would not die easily. They listened for the deep, rolling tone of 4 engines, a sound that meant life once, a sound they would never hear again in the same way. At Tempelhof, the airfield had become a monument. The Americans maintained it as their headquarters in Berlin, its curved terminal, the largest building in the world, standing like a concrete crescent embracing the city it had fed. On the western apron, a handful of C-54 Skymasters sat on static display, their fuselages polished, their names painted fresh. Spirit of Freedom, Rosen Bomber, Miss Liberty. Berliners visited them on Sundays, bringing their children, telling the story of how these machines had carried bread instead of bombs. The stories multiplied, small and human. A boy who had once chased candy parachutes became an air traffic controller. A woman who had unloaded coal with bare hands became a nurse at Tempelhof's clinic. Mechanics who had kept aircraft flying through ice and exhaustion stayed on as instructors for German apprentices. The airlift had created not only survival, but a generation defined by discipline and endurance. In the American sector, General Lucius D. Clay prepared to leave Germany. His office overlooked the Tiergarten, where the first green shoots of recovery sprouted among the rubble. On his desk lay his final report to Washington, a thick dossier bound in grey cloth, stamped confidential. Inside were graphs, maps, and photographs documenting every phase of the airlift. But at the end, he added a single handwritten note, a sentence he refused to have typed. The Berlin airlift demonstrated that moral courage, when sustained by industrial will, is stronger than any blockade on earth. He signed his name beneath it and closed the file. The Soviet Union, humiliated but unbroken, turned inward. The failure of the blockade hardened Stalin's resolve. The Berlin airlift had not defeated communism, but it had defined its limits. From Moscow's perspective, it was the first great confrontation of the Cold War and their first undeniable loss. In response, Stalin ordered the acceleration of nuclear research, the expansion of Eastern Europe's air defence networks, and the construction of the Berlin Wall's conceptual ancestor. a division not of geography, but of ideology. For the West, the airlift became a legend before the decade even ended. Films were made, books published, medals struck. The words airlift veteran became a badge of quiet pride. In American cities, returning airmen gave lectures to school children who had never heard of Berlin except as a name in the news. They showed photographs of endless runways, of grey aircraft vanishing into fog, of German children smiling beneath parachutes of candy. The audiences were silent. The story didn't need embellishment. Back in Berlin, Tunner's system lived on. The corridors remained open, permanently designated by international law as free air routes. Civilian pilots flying to West Berlin in later years would glance at their flight paths and see the same coordinates Tunner's men had flown by, Celle to Tempelhof, Fassberg to Gatow, etched into their charts like relics of faith. The sky itself had been codified by sacrifice. The Germans themselves began to see the airlift as more than salvation. It was identity. For a people haunted by guilt and ruin, it was the first story of redemption. Berliners could say, with truth, that they had endured not by force, but by cooperation, that the same allies who once bombed their city had later saved it. In that contradiction lay a new kind of peace. In 1950, the first memorial parade was held at Tempelhof. The crowd filled the field, Americans, Britons, French and Germans standing shoulder to shoulder. 3 C-54s flew overhead in formation, dropping wreaths instead of candy. Each wreath carried a single inscription: "We kept you alive." The veterans of the airlift stood at attention, their uniforms faded, their faces older than the year before. Among them were African American airmen from the 332nd Fighter Wing and the 463rd Troop Carrier Group, men who had flown in a segregated military but been celebrated by a grateful foreign people. For many, Berlin had been the first place they were treated as equals. When they spoke of it, their words carried both pride and irony. "We fought 2 wars," one said quietly, "one in the air and one at home. Berlin was where we won the first one." By the middle of the 1950s, the story of the airlift had entered textbooks across the West. It was no longer just history, it was doctrine. The operation proved that supply chains could be weapons, that volume could be victory, that discipline could replace destruction. The principles of the Red Ball Express, the wasteful, relentless, victorious logistics of war, had found their echo in peace. Historians later called it industrial diplomacy. Engineers called it logistical genius. But the people who lived through it called it something simpler: life. One evening, a BBC correspondent asked an old Berliner what the airlift had meant to her. She paused before answering. "It meant," she said, "that the world had not gone mad forever." In that sentence lay the true legacy of the operation. It was not only about tons of cargo or missions flown, it was about restoration, the moment when faith in humanity returned on the wings of machines once built for war. When winter came again in 1949, the cold was sharp but bearable. Berliners no longer feared it. The coal bins were full. The lights stayed on. And sometimes, in the quieter night, when the city slept and the wind swept across the rooftops, someone would swear they heard it again. The deep, steady murmur of engines passing high above, like the heartbeat of a sky that had once refused to let them die. It was not illusion. It was memory, the kind that endures longer than empires, longer than borders, the kind of memory that proves that logistics, when fueled by belief, can rewrite destiny. And though the Berlin airlift ended in 1949, its message would cross every decade that followed, that courage is not always loud, that salvation can be scheduled, and that even in the darkest blockade, humanity can still fly. November 7th, 1949, Berlin. The first snow fell over Berlin just as the city's lights flickered on, 1,000 small signals of survival. From the air, had there still been pilots above to see it, the city looked whole again, streets glowing faintly beneath the haze, trams moving like veins of light, chimneys breathing warmth into the cold sky. It was the first winter since the blockade began that Berliners faced without fear of darkness. The airlift had ended, but its shadow still stretched across the season. In Tempelhof's main terminal, the vast hall that had once echoed with the boots of Nazi parades now rang with the steady footsteps of civilians. Travellers moved through its arched corridors where airmen had once carried sacks of coal. American MPs still guarded the doors, but now their rifles were slung loose, their faces calm. The war, the siege, the blockade, all had passed. The building, like the city, had learned to live again. On the airfield itself, new aircraft had arrived, civilian transports, bearing the markings of Pan American Airways. The first commercial flight from New York to Berlin landed at Tempelhof on November 6, 1949. As it taxied to a halt, hundreds gathered behind the fences, waving despite the snow. The passengers stepped out to applause. The pilot, an airlift veteran named Captain Harold the Voyant Smith, removed his cap and bowed slightly. "Different cargo," he told the reporters waiting at the gate, "but same spirit." Inside the city, life reorganised around that spirit. Cafes reopened along Unted and Linden. Markets filled again with colour, apples from the Rhineland, butter from Denmark, tins from America stamped US Army surplus. The ruins still loomed everywhere. Burnt-out churches, hollow apartment blocks, but between them rose scaffolding, cranes, motion. Berlin's heartbeat had returned. In the western sectors, Allied officers worked with German administrators to establish the first institutions of self-government. Mayor Ernst Reuter, whose voice had carried through loudspeakers during the blockade, now stood at the head of a city that had become the frontier of freedom. He called Berlin a symbol of the will of mankind not to bow before oppression. His words were broadcast in a dozen languages, printed in newspapers from London to Los Angeles. And yet, beyond the Brandenburg Gate, the other Berlin watched. In the Soviet sector, reconstruction followed a different rhythm, strict, ordered, silent. There were no neon signs, no jazz clubs, no American jeeps in the streets. Instead, the red flag of the Socialist Unity Party hung over government buildings, and portraits of Stalin stared down from walls that once bore Nazi eagles. The airlift had ended the blockade but birthed something else, the divided world. In the West, Tunner's system became legend. His logistics manuals circulated through military academies. Diagrams of aircraft corridors appeared in textbooks. The phrases he'd used, flow control, turnaround efficiency, maintenance rotation, entered the vocabulary of modern aviation. His principle, no plane waits, no man rests until the line is fed, became doctrine from Korea to Vietnam to every humanitarian airlift that followed. But Tunner himself had left Berlin weeks earlier. He was in the Pacific now, commanding new routes, applying old lessons. The men who had served under him scattered, some to airlines, some to cargo firms, some to small towns where no one quite believed the stories they told. "We fed a city," they would say, and people would smile politely, not understanding that it was literal truth. In the ruins of Berlin, the memory remained sharper. At Tempelhof, the hangars still smelled faintly of fuel and coal. Children climbed onto the old sandbag bunkers near the perimeter and played airlift. One group pretended to be pilots, others played the ground crews, others, the Berliners, waiting with empty buckets. It was a game that always ended the same way. The planes arrived, the people cheered, the city survived. By December, the first anniversary of the blockade's lifting approached. The Western Allies planned a ceremony at Tempelhof. Invitations went to every airlift veteran who could be reached. The British sent representatives from Fassberg and Gatow, the Americans from Rhine-Main, the French from Tegel. Berlin's newspapers published photographs of smiling airmen returning to the city they had once saved. On December 12, 1949, a crowd of 10,000 gathered on the runway. The weather was bitterly cold, wind slicing across the open tarmac. At noon, 3 aircraft flew overhead, a C-54, an Avro York, and a French Ju-52. Their formation cast 3 long shadows across the snow, merging as they passed over the Hunger Hark Memorial. General Clay spoke first, his voice slow and deliberate. "We came here not as conquerors," he said, "but as builders. We stayed not because we had to, but because we chose to. Berlin is free because free men refused to give it up." The applause lasted a full minute, then the crowd fell silent as a small group of Berlin children stepped forward, carrying white roses. They laid them at the base of the memorial. One of them, a girl with braids and a wool coat 2 sizes too large, looked up and whispered to the stone, "Danke." The photographers caught it, and the image appeared in newspapers around the world. That night, lights burned late in Berlin's western sectors. In cafes and bars, veterans and civilians talked deep into the morning. They spoke of the winter of 48, of fog so thick it swallowed the runways, of coal dust that turned their hands black, of engines that never stopped. They laughed at old fears, toasted absent friends, and for the first time in years spoke of the future without flinching. Far to the east, in Moscow, the reports reached Stalin. He read them without expression and then folded the papers neatly and set them aside. "They fed one city," he said finally, "but they cannot feed the world." It was a statement both dismissive and prophetic. He understood too late that the contest was no longer for territory, but for systems, for the power to sustain rather than destroy. In Berlin, the snow thickened. The last visitors left Tempelhof, leaving the memorial wreathed in flowers frozen into ice. The airfield lights glowed faintly beneath the storm. Somewhere in the darkness, a single engine started, a test run, a maintenance check, but the sound carried far across the sleeping city. People stirred in their beds, smiling in their dreams, mistaking it for what it once was, the sound of rescue. That night, a final transport flight took off, unannounced. It carried no cargo, no passengers, just a single crate marked Archive. Inside were records of the airlift, flight logs, manifests, maintenance schedules, weather charts, and thousands of photographs. The crate was bound for Washington, but what it carried was more than history. It was proof. Proof that the sky could be conquered not for war, but for mercy. As the aircraft rose into the storm, its navigation lights flashed red and green through the falling snow, fading into the clouds. Below, Berlin slept peacefully for the first winter in memory, its streets lit, its people fed, its fate secured. The airlift was over, but its legacy had just begun. From that day forward, every plane that carried food instead of bombs, medicine instead of soldiers, hope instead of fear, everyone traced its lineage to the narrow air corridors over Berlin, where men had once turned logistics into salvation. And though time would dim the engine's roar, the truth remained, immutable as the cold air itself, that in the darkest hour of the century, when walls rose and hunger closed in, mankind's answer had come not from force, not from conquest, but from flight. And above the frozen city, the sky that had once thundered with wings now kept its silence, holding within it the echo of the moment when humanity refused to let itself fall. December 31st, 1949. Berlin. The last night of the decade came cold and windless. Snow covered the city like a clean bandage over an old wound. From the rooftops of Charlottenburg to the darkened spires of Mitte, Berlin lay wrapped in frost and silence. But this silence was different from the kind the city had once known. It was not the silence of siege, nor the silence of fear. It was the silence of endurance. Inside Tempelhof, the cavernous terminal was lit for celebration. American, British, and French flags hung side by side along the upper balconies, fluttering faintly in the draught of the old hangar doors. Tables were set where coal sacks had once been stacked. German musicians tuned their instruments beside the runway. And gathered there, mechanics, pilots, Berliners, officers, civilians, were the men and women who had once kept the city alive. Colonel William Tunner had returned briefly from his new post in the Pacific. His hair was greyer now, his face thinner, but the same intensity remained in his eyes. He moved through the crowd quietly, shaking hands, nodding to faces he hadn't seen since the blockade. Someone handed him a cup of coffee, and he stood for a moment near the runway windows, looking out at the snow-covered field. He could still see it, the lines of C-54s taxiing nose to tail, the red wands of the ground crew flashing through fog, the lights glimmering down the corridor toward Wiesbaden and Fassberg. Now the field was empty, a vast white plain stretching into the night. The ghosts of engines seemed to hum faintly in the wind. General Lucius D. Clay joined him, his uniform immaculate even in retirement. He placed a hand on Tunner's shoulder. "You can almost hear them, can't you?" Tunner nodded. "Every time the wind shifts," he said. They stood in silence for a while, listening to the wind sweep through the hangars. Then Clay said softly, "We showed them something they never understood. You can blockade an army, but you can't blockade will." Across the room, a German children's choir began to sing, clear, high voices carrying through the echoing terminal. The song was Stille Nacht. The simplicity of it held everyone still. For a moment, even the Americans forgot English and the Germans forgot defeat. It was one of those rare moments in history when memory and hope occupy the same breath. When the song ended, Tunner walked to the podium placed near the great doors and looked over the crowd. There were hundreds, airmen, Berliners, Allied officials, engineers, and the families of those who hadn't lived to see the victory. He didn't need notes. His voice was quiet, almost conversational. 15 months ago, he began, this city was dying. It was dying because men believed that hunger could break the spirit of free people. They were wrong. They thought fuel and food could not fly through the sky. They were wrong again. They thought the air could be a wall. But we made it a road. He paused. The hall was utterly still. In those months, we flew more than 277,000 missions. We lost good men. We burned millions of gallons of fuel. We wore out trucks, tyres and engines. But we proved something that will outlast all of us. That logistics is not about numbers. It's about belief. You can calculate weight and speed and altitude, but you can't calculate what happens when people refuse to quit. There was no applause at first, just silence. Then someone began to clap and the sound spread until it filled the hangar like the roar of distant propellers. Later that night, as midnight approached, Berliners filled the streets despite the cold. They gathered outside Tempelhof, along the Kurfürstendamm on the steps of the Reichstag. Someone had brought a radio, and as the hour struck 12, the voice of Mayor Ernst Reuter came over the airwaves. This year, he said, we lived not because the world permitted it, but because it helped us choose life. We will not forget the sound that kept us alive. We will not forget the men who turned the sky into a bridge. And we will never again doubt that freedom can fly. Fireworks burst over the western districts, modest, improvised, but bright. They rose and faded over the rooftops, echoing faintly off the stone ruins that still scarred the city's heart. For the first time in years, Berlin celebrated not the end of something, but its own endurance. At Tempelhof, Tunner and Clay stood outside as the fireworks flared. The general turned to Tunner. Do you think they'll remember this 50 years from now? Tunner smiled faintly. They'll remember the sound, he said. The rest doesn't matter. Above them, the clouds parted briefly, revealing a sky cold and clear and infinite. For an instant, the city seemed suspended between past and future, between the ruins of war and the promise of peace, between earth and sky. When the last spark faded, the night returned to silence. But to those who had lived through it, that silence was full of echoes, the hum of engines through fog, the whistle of landing gear in crosswinds, the cheers of children chasing chocolate bars through the rubble. In that silence lived a truth the century would carry forward, that the strength of nations is measured not only by how fiercely they fight, but by how steadfastly they sustain. That the machinery of war, turned to mercy, becomes more powerful than any weapon. That faith, multiplied by fuel and courage, can keep a city alive against the world's coldest wind. Years later, Berlin would rise again, steel and glass replacing stone and ash. The war would come, and the war would fall. New wars would rage and end. But through it all, the lesson of the airlift would endure, that the measure of civilization lies not in conquest, but in care. And when future generations walked through Tempelhof's silent hangars, they would feel it still, that faint vibration beneath the concrete, like the memory of engines that once carried freedom through the darkest sky on earth. At midnight, the lights dimmed and Berlin entered a new year, alive, rebuilt, unbroken. And though the engines had stopped, their echo remained, deep and steady, the eternal heartbeat of a city that refused to die. January 10th, 1950, Berlin. The snow had hardened into a crust of ice that cracked under every bootstep. The first days of the new year were sharp and quiet, the kind of cold that froze breath in the air. Berlin seemed suspended, half ruin, half rebirth, its streets divided between shadow and the faint promise of dawn. The airlift was history now, but it lingered everywhere, in conversation, in memory, in the very rhythm of life. Every morning people still looked to the sky before starting their day, out of habit more than hope. Old instincts die hard. Shopkeepers, widows, mechanics, children, each had once lived by the sound of approaching engines. The air above them had once meant survival. Now it was only sky again, vast and empty. In the western sectors, reconstruction had become the new campaign. Cranes rose above the ruins like metal trees. American engineers worked beside German masons, French surveyors beside Berlin labourers. Cement trucks replaced aircraft, roads, rails, and telephone lines replaced air corridors. But the sense of shared purpose remained, the same quiet discipline that had defined the airlift transposed from sky to earth. At Tempelhof, the operations office had been converted into a civil aviation centre. The walls still bore marks from the blackout curtains, and the smell of oil and coffee lingered like ghosts. On the runway, Pan Am and British European Airways ran daily flights to Frankfurt and London. For Berliners, the sight of those silver aircraft lifting through the cold air was comforting, a reminder that the world beyond the Iron Curtain was still within reach. On January 8th, a ceremony was held in the hangar that once housed the maintenance crews. It was small and solemn, no generals, no speeches. A simple plaque was unveiled, cast in dark bronze, reading, "To the men and women of the Berlin Airlift, who turned the sky into a bridge and kept a city alive." There were no cameras, only silence as the crowd stood before it. Then an elderly German woman stepped forward, her coat threadbare but clean, and placed a single loaf of bread at the base. She said nothing, only bowed her head. Around her others began to do the same, small offerings of thanks, a few flowers, a child's toy plane, a lump of coal. That night, Colonel William H. Tunner, now preparing to depart permanently for the Pacific, stood by his hotel window overlooking the spree. Below him, the river moved sluggishly under ice, its surface reflecting the faint glow of street lamps. He could hear the distant echo of trains, sound replacing the silence that had once ruled the city. Berlin was breathing again. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the tin pot on the windowsill. It was black, bitter, and burned, but it was real, no longer a ration. He thought of the faces he had seen these past years. Young pilots half asleep in cockpits, Berlin women unloading coal by hand, children waving from the ruins. He thought of the ones who hadn't survived, the lost aircraft, the crews buried in frozen ground, their names written now only in manifests and memory. In his mind, he replayed the operation, the sheer scope of it, the improbable precision. 277,000 flights, 2.3 million tons, 101 lives, the math of endurance, the physics of mercy, the greatest convoy in human history, measured not in miles conquered, but in hunger denied. He remembered what General Clay had said on the last night of the blockade: "You can blockade land, but not the sky." In Moscow, meanwhile, the Politburo debated quietly what had gone wrong. Reports from Soviet intelligence painted a picture of technical failure and psychological defeat. One aide remarked, "The Americans won not by arms, but by organisation." Stalin, seated in silence, read the transcripts of captured German officers who had marvelled at the operation. He said only, "They have learned industry as strategy." Then with characteristic brevity, "So must we." That single acknowledgement, spoken in a dim Kremlin office on a cold January morning, would shape the next 40 years. The arms race that followed, the space race that began, the shadow war of supply and production, all had their roots in that realisation. The Berlin Airlift had redefined power. From then on, every superpower would measure strength, not just in weapons, but in throughput. Back in Berlin, the airlift's veterans began to leave. One by one, the transports carried them west, leaving behind a city that owed them its existence. At the airfield gates, Berliners gathered to see them off. They brought flowers, hand-painted signs, and loaves of bread still warm from morning ovens. "Danke, Freunde," the signs read. "Thank you, friends." An American corporal named James Harris, who had spent the previous year loading trucks with coal and fixing engines in the snow, paused before boarding. A German boy, no older than 12, handed him a small wooden plane carved from firewood. "For you," the boy said, "so you don't forget us." Harris knelt, took the plane, and smiled. "We won't," he said. "We never will." In the weeks that followed, Berlin settled into its uneasy new peace. The Soviets fortified their sector, building fences and checkpoints. The Allies built schools and housing projects. The city became both symbol and battlefield of ideology. Yet underneath the politics, a quieter truth persisted, an unspoken bond between the people who had lived through the blockade and those who had kept them alive. At night, in the quiet neighbourhoods of Charlottenburg and Spandau, families told their children stories of the days when the sky had rumbled like a living thing. They described the lights descending through the clouds, the smell of diesel and coal dust, the taste of chocolate bars dropped from the heavens. They told it as one might tell a legend, not because it was exaggerated, but because it seemed impossible even to those who had seen it. Years later, when the first generation of post-war children grew up, they would find it hard to believe that an entire city had once survived only by air. Yet the evidence remained in the memorials, the photographs, the quiet pride in their parents' voices when they spoke of those days. The airlift had become Berlin's mythology, proof that faith, precision and machinery could save a civilization. On his final night in Germany, Tunner wrote a last letter to Clay. It was short, handwritten in pencil. General, we proved that the limits of logistics are only the limits of imagination. When people ask what it took to save Berlin, I'll tell them the truth. It took patience, planning, and 6,000 engines that refused to quit. But mostly, it took belief. The kind that can move mountains, or 2.3 million tons, if it has to. See you in Washington. He left the letter on his desk, sealed in an envelope marked, to be forwarded. The next morning, his plane lifted off from Rhine-Main, heading west over the snow-covered land that had once been the battleground of the century. As Berlin disappeared beneath the clouds, he looked down one last time. The city seemed small now, a patch of grey and white, stitched together by the spree. But to him it was enormous, eternal, the place where the modern world had been reborn, not in fire but in fuel and faith. And somewhere deep in the engine's steady hum, he thought he heard the faint echo of all the flights that had come before, thousands of propellers turning in unison, carrying not bombs or soldiers, but life itself. The sky had once been a weapon. Over Berlin it had become salvation, and long after the last plane vanished into history, that sky would remain, the quiet monument to a year when men learned that the power to destroy is nothing compared to the power to sustain. February 2nd, 1950, Berlin. The winter fog hung low over the city, thick as smoke. It softened the jagged silhouettes of half-ruined buildings and muffled the sound of distant trams. From above, had one flown over the western districts that morning, Berlin might have seemed peaceful, orderly, calm, even whole. But below the fog, life was still a work of endurance. Reconstruction came in inches, not leaps. Every brick laid, every tram wire reconnected, every light restored was a small act of defiance against the memory of siege. At Tempelhof, the airfield that had once been the heart of the airlift, the vast runways lay under frost. Only a few flights moved in and out now, commercial charters, diplomatic aircraft, the occasional military courier. Yet the old routines persisted. The control tower still logged the weather every hour. Ground crews still tested the runway lights at dusk. The airfield lived on through habit and respect, a shrine that never called itself one. In the Allied headquarters near the Tiergarten, General Lucius D. Clay prepared for his final departure from Germany. His successor had already arrived. His desk was bare except for a single object, a piece of black coal mounted on a wooden base. The plaque read, Berlin, 1948-49, proof that will is fuel. It had been given to him by the Citizens Committee the week before, at a ceremony where thousands gathered despite sub-zero temperatures. Clay had spoken briefly then, his words broadcast to the world. We came to Berlin because freedom was under siege. We stayed because freedom cannot survive without faith. We leave now knowing that no wall, no blockade, no tyranny will ever again close the sky. Those words had travelled farther than any flight, reprinted in newspapers from Boston to Bombay, quoted in parliaments and pulpits. In Moscow, the speech had been read with fury. In Washington, with quiet pride. Clay's staff waited for him outside as he took one last look from his office window. The Tiergarten lay white beneath a pale sky. The bombed-out spire of the Kaiser Wilhelm Church stood in the distance like a broken watchtower. Somewhere beyond it, the invisible line of division cut through the heart of the city. The general turned from the view, took his greatcoat from the rack, and left without another glance. At the airfield, a crowd of Berliners had gathered to see him off. Many held signs that read simply, Danke, General Clay. Some waved small American flags, others photographs of their families. A group of children sang On the Wings of a Dove, their voices faint in the cold wind. Clay paused at the steps of the aircraft and raised his hand in salute. For a long moment, the crowd remained silent. Then, from somewhere near the front, an old man began to clap. The sound spread until the entire field echoed with applause, slow, deliberate, unending. The engine started, the propellers turning with that familiar rising growl that had once meant salvation. Clay took his seat and looked out the window. The city fell away beneath him, its streets winding like veins through the snow. He thought of the people he had met, the mothers who had dug coal from the snowbanks, the mechanics who had kept engines alive with spare parts and faith, the children who had learned to spell freedom before they learned to write their own names. For Clay, Berlin was no longer a city. It was an idea, fragile, enduring, impossible to conquer. In the Soviet zone, the reaction was different. To the east, where the streets bore portraits of Marx and Lenin, the airlift was not mentioned in public. The newspapers spoke only of Western provocation. But in the privacy of kitchens and barracks, even those under Soviet control admitted grudging respect. One East German policeman was overheard saying, "They dropped bread instead of bombs." That's how they won. He was reassigned the next week to a remote post near Dresden. The Western Allies turned their success into structure. The lessons of the airlift became the backbone of a new world order. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, signed in April 1949, now gained substance, its logistics plans, its doctrine of readiness, its insistence that supply was strategy, all drawn directly from the Berlin model. The same principles that had kept one city alive would now protect a continent. Across the Atlantic in Washington, the story of Berlin had already entered legend. Congressional committees cited it as proof of American purpose. University lectures analysed it as a case study in moral engineering. Newspapers printed photographs of smiling Berlin children beneath headlines that read, "The sky that fed a city." But for those who had lived through it, legend was unnecessary. Memory was enough. In a small apartment on the Kurfürstendamm, a former teacher named Lotte Weber kept a diary. She had begun it on the first day of the blockade and ended it the night the airlift ceased. Her final entry read, "They thought we would kneel, but we stood. They thought the sky belonged to them, but it belonged to us. When the engines came, we knew what freedom sounded like." She left the diary to her son, who decades later would become a historian. He would publish it under the title The Sound of Wings. It would sell in 30 countries and become one of the defining testaments of post-war endurance. Meanwhile, at Tempelhof, a new generation of pilots took to the air. Many were the sons of those who had lived through the blockade. They flew for Pan Am and BOAC, their uniforms crisp, their aircraft gleaming with civilian pride. Yet the route charts they followed were the same, the narrow corridors west through the air, carved in the days when flight meant survival. Each time they passed through them, they carried invisible cargo, remembrance. That February, the Berlin government declared March 28th, the day the first airlift plane had landed 2 years earlier, a civic holiday. They called it Tag der Brücke, the Day of the Bridge. On that day each year, the city would fall silent at noon for 1 minute while aircraft flew overhead in salute. The tradition would endure for decades. To Berliners, the meaning was simple. The bridge had not been of steel or stone, but of belief. As winter gave way to spring, the snow melted, and with it some of the old fear. The trees in the Tiergarten budded again for the first time since before the war. People walked freely across the western sectors, unafraid of darkness, unafraid of hunger. The airlift had not merely saved them, it had taught them to trust in themselves again. And in that reborn trust lay the foundation of something far greater, the quiet certainty that no tyranny, however vast, could outlast the courage of the ordinary. Berlin had been starved, bombed and divided, but never broken, and as long as its people remembered the sound of wings over the night sky, it never would be. March 28th, 1950, Berlin. The sky was clear, the city quiet. 2 years had passed since the first planes came through the clouds, carrying life instead of war. Berlin was no longer starving, no longer afraid. The runways at Tempelhof stood empty now, but the people still gathered there, looking up as 3 planes flew low in salute. No speeches, no fanfare, just the sound of engines fading into the distance, the same sound that had once meant survival. When the sky grew silent again, Berliners turned and went home. The blockade was memory now, the airlift history. But the lesson remained, that courage, when joined with will, can lift an entire city, and sometimes the world above despair.